Good evening, welcome to Jim Chapman Live on Rogers Television. Tonight we take a look at probably the most contentious issue across Canada today, and that's the federal government's proposal to decriminalize the possession of small amounts of marijuana. Bob Metz joins us to talk about that issue, and we're also going to meet the man who's the campaign manager for Stephen Harper, the leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition in Ottawa, the Alliance Party of Canada. That plus our You Say survey, our media misfire, and who knows what else might turn up tonight on Jim Chapman Live on Rogers Television. In just a few minutes, we're going to meet our first guest tonight on Jim Chapman Live, Bob Metz, and we're going to talk about the proposed decriminalization of marijuana in the country. And I want to make that our You Say survey question tonight, too, because I know it's a question on which most Canadians do have an opinion one way or the other. You're going to hear us discuss both sides of the argument as the program proceeds tonight, and we hope you'll take the opportunity to pick up the telephone and tell us what you think based on what you already know or what you may hear tonight. It's a straightforward question. Do you support the decriminalization of marijuana in Canada as proposed by the Liberal government? Now, there are a number of elements to this, not the least of which is the Americans aren't happy about it, and that may well make it more difficult for Canadians to get across the border. The American war on drugs is still going full steam, and although there are some American states that have taken exception to the stringent controls that the federal government wants to maintain, the fact is that most American states still do frown on marijuana use, and if you get busted, it can lead to some very serious consequences. Here in Canada, the federal government, at least Mr. Cauchon, the Minister of Justice, says the time has come to reform the laws. We have to make some changes here. Giving people criminal records for using marijuana isn't a good idea, he says, and it's time to change that. However, they're going to increase the penalties for people who grow or distribute it, and there is no mechanism in place to restrict the use of marijuana by people who are driving. In fact, we have no tests to determine whether people are impaired or not, and this has raised the concern of many Canadians. Is it a gateway drug to harder drugs? Well, we're going to talk about that. Is this a bad move for Canada or a positive step forward in an enlightened 21st century approach to drugs and drug use in this country? We'd like to know what you think, and our question again is a simple one. Do you favor the decriminalization of marijuana? Yes or no? Give us a call, 672-1313. Operators are standing by to take your call, to register your vote, and listen to your opinion. 672-1313. Do you support the decriminalization of marijuana? We'll be back in a moment with Bob Metz, a man who studied this issue for a number of years, and we'll take a look at some of the implications for the government's proposals and whether or not they're really serious about it. That's another element of the story, too. We're going to do all of that tonight here on Rogers Television as we continue with Jim Chapman Live. I think it's probably fair to say that it was the #1 story across Canada today, and that's the new federal proposals to decriminalize the possession of small amounts of marijuana, the amount that you might have for your own personal use. At the same time, the government is proposing much more stringent restrictions on people who grow and or traffic in marijuana, up to 14 years in jail. But the act of simple possession, as proposed by Justice Minister Martin Cauchon, would reduce it to a bit of a misdemeanor with a fine and no permanent record of the fact that you got busted. This is seen as a step forward by many people. Others say it's too confusing, though. What is the government trying to tell us? On the one hand, they say it's okay to use it, but it's not okay to grow it, it's not okay to sell it. Bob Metz has made a study of this area, along with a lot of other things relative to the government, and joins us tonight. Robert, nice to have you here.
Good evening, Jim.
I know from experience, and many of our viewers will certainly be experienced with your views because they've heard you on Talk of the Town and seen you on numerous television programs over the years. You have a generalized concern about government regulation. How do the specifics of your concern apply to this issue here? Some people, I would think, would be pleased at the idea that the federal government is lightening its grip on us here. Do you see it that way?
No, I don't, in fact. In fact, I see it as quite the opposite. They're strengthening their grip. And I don't see why the U.S. would be concerned, since some other states are already decriminalized, and as we heard on your show earlier today, a couple of states even are selling pot legally. So why they're picking on us for this one little nuance where, in fact, we are making the drug laws stronger. The fines are going up for people who grow and who sell, but down only for that small percentage of people who have under, I believe it's 15 grams. And I think what we're going to see then is a lot of arguments in the courts over whether something actually weighed 15 grams or 14 or 13 or whatever, you know, and trying to get up. You can just see the courts clog up with minutia.
This going to be a make-work project for lawyers then?
Oh, terrifically so. In fact, you know, it bothers me, in fact, really, that we even have what I would call drug prohibition in a free society in the first place. It's kind of amazing that a nation that's decided that the state has no business in the bedrooms of the nation, that it has some business in our bodies and in our homes and in our personal choices of lifestyle. How we came to that, I don't know.
They want to stay out of the bedroom but not out of the rec room.
That's right. And you know, the history of cannabis prohibition is very recent. It's only been illegal for about 80 years in Canada. In fact, according to my quick dates here, it was first made illegal in 1923 under the Opium and Narcotic Act. In 1954 was the first time that possession was created as an offense, which is a very strange offense because I think it's one of those issues, just possession in and of itself, that is almost anti-democratic and anti-justice, because you can be fined for simply possessing something. The police don't have to prove how you got it, where you got it from, if you sold it to anyone. Just the fact that you possess it, there's no chain of events, which makes it very easy for anyone to plant some drugs on you, call the police, and you're guilty. It's reverse onus. You're guilty until you can prove yourself innocent. And in that sense, drug laws are a complete violation of what we see as a standard of justice. And then in 1961, the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs took effect, and this provided marijuana laws, get this, with the second heaviest minimum sentences under Canadian criminal law, surpassed only by those imposed for capital and non-capital murder. Now, what does that tell you? You know?
So if we look then at this government intrusion, and we try to, from an objective point of view, try to be as objective as we can, and I'm going to try to be objective tonight, even though I'm not on this issue. I'm going to try to be. The government says that we need to do this, or we have needed to do this, because this is A, a dangerous drug, and B, we already have enough legal dangerous drugs. We've already got alcohol. We recognize that that's a dangerous drug, but it's such an ingrained part of our society that we can't do anything about it. We already have tobacco, which is a tremendously dangerous drug, but again, it's ingrained in our society. We have gambling, which is a dangerous addiction for many people, but it's ingrained in our society. What do you say to people who would say, well, why add one more to it? Why go down that road?
Well, we're not adding it. It's there already. Marijuana, in fact, as I understand it, many times it comes up as the second largest single industry underground, competing with some of the largest legitimate industries we have in the country. So it's there. And drug prohibition laws are the things that actually fuel the whole drug trade, because for starters, I think marijuana itself would be almost worthless if it were totally legalized and free. People would grow it. It wouldn't really have much of a market value except for a very small niche of people. And that's what makes it very unpalatable to governments. It's very difficult to tax, very difficult to do to marijuana what you can do with alcohol and with tobacco, which, by the way, are far stronger drugs, okay? And the government gets its take on them, and that's why they're legal, and that's why the government's taking over the whole vice industry, in fact. They're into gambling. They run a thing called the LCBO, the Liquor Control Board of Ontario. Do you think the Liquor Control Board actually controls liquor? Of course not. It controls a monopoly market. Well, that's what the word control is meant to refer to, and it's the same in drug prohibition.
It's interesting that you say that, too, because there are, within very strict limitations or strict exceptions, you can't make your own liquor. I mean, you can, to a certain extent. You can brew your own beer, you can brew your own wine, but you got to pay all the appropriate taxes and so on. You can't just go home and mix up a batch in basements against the law.
Exactly. And again, because it does take that much of a process, it's easier to control because it's a longer process. Marijuana, you put a seed in a pot, done. Done for the season. How do you control that? So, you know, it's a very nebulous thing to deal with in terms of dealing with marijuana per se. But the whole concept of drug prohibition is just a fundamental issue of you know, you talk about drug abuse and drug use. Today on your show you said something that I found very compelling. And I'm going to try and almost quote you here. You said you used to work in a community, like in the music, when you were a musician, where you saw all kinds of people who used drugs wisely and unwisely. I thought it was interesting you made that distinction, because you said it's not the drug, it's the usage, and that's absolutely true. I agree with you. I've had many doctors tell me that there's no such thing as a bad drug, there's only bad habits. And that's the whole issue. Even George Carlin is going around now. I know he's had some tough times with certain drugs. And he's telling the story, you know, about, yeah, they can get you. But most people don't get into trouble.
Well, what about the argument that it's a gateway to harder drugs? I mean, this is one that's brought up every time this issue comes up. They say, no, it is a gateway, and it leads people. Everybody who takes heroin started smoking marijuana, is the argument.
Well, I disagree. A gateway implies cause and effect. That's not what's going on. What's happening is it's more like a pick door number 1, pick door number 2, or pick door number 3. The person who has gone on to a harder drug like cigarettes or alcohol from marijuana, for example, probably tried marijuana and it didn't give them the high that they were looking for.
But that's not the connection. You know that's not the connection people make.
No, of course not. But I make it purposely because I think those two drugs are more powerful than marijuana, and yet they're legal. And I've seen people quit marijuana and go to alcohol. That's a big problem. So the fact that it's legal or illegal is, to me, a non-issue. To keep the drug at least within a legal realm, you can deal with it better on a social level. You can deal with drug addiction, for example, without having to be worried about the police busting your doors down. You can actually go to somebody and get help if you get to that point. But we have to be aware that this is always a minority of people we're talking about. If you look at the amount of money that goes through the drug trade, you would almost think that every single person on the face of the planet was stoned every day of the week. You know what I mean? That's just how it looks. And if that's the case, if there's that much drug use going on, it can't be as bad as everybody's trying to tell us.
Well, that's an it's an interesting point that you raised, because there's a similar argument has been, or a similar point has been raised about the pornography industry. And I'm not comparing the two, but I just want to make this point.
That's a good comparison.
Well, people in the porn industry, one of the things they say about it is when people come down on them for doing it, they say, you know, isn't it interesting that this is an industry that generates, I think, $5 billion a year in the United States. He said, but nobody uses it. Right? Nobody buys it. Nobody buys it. Nobody watches it. But it's a $5 billion industry.
And it's in every single variety store in the city.
Exactly. So here we are in marijuana. As you say, there's tremendous amounts of money going on here. There must be a ton of people using it and not talking about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's what the underground markets are all about, and that's what they're really trying to control. They're trying to get a control of the market. That's why they go after sellers and the big producers, and they don't really want to bother with the users. They're counting on the users being there for when they take over the market.
You think that's where they're heading?
Absolutely, because there's no other way to win with that issue from the government's point of view, other than to get rid of the laws entirely. You know, I dislike the whole idea of saying that you can even blame a drug, or like you pick pornography, for someone's bad behavior. I think it's giving someone a patented excuse to get off for their behavior. At the root of all these laws and everyone's concern is that we're concerned about living in a peaceful society. We want to see people behave well, not threaten anyone, not be violent, not be inebriated on the streets where they might present danger because they're driving in a car. These are all rational things to want, but we don't get them through drug prohibition. That's just not going to happen.
Bob Metz with us tonight. I'll refer to him for the purposes of tonight's discussion as a political philosopher, and we'll be back to discuss some more political philosophy surrounding drug prohibition in Canada as Jim Chapman Live continues here on Rogers Television. Bob Metz is our guest tonight. I've referred to him as a political philosopher. I think that's pretty accurate. He's a man with a great interest in the way our laws work in this country. We're talking tonight about proposed changes to the drug laws, the decriminalization of small amounts of marijuana. Bob, I want to ask you about, I want to come back to sort of the baseline justification for the government. Now, you're saying that you see this as a first step towards the government taking over the monopoly. Well, is that the only reason you think why they're doing this?
Let's step back for a sec. Really, I don't see anything happening here. I don't think this legislation is going to go through. You know, the Liberals have flown this idea ever since the Ledane Commission in the 70s to legalize, decriminalize, whatever. They've used all sorts of words throughout all those years. And they've always come to a situation like this where they're about to produce some sort of legislation. And I think they made this legislation wiry enough and confusing enough and contradictory enough that it wouldn't get through, almost with the hope that it wouldn't. In one way, I guess it's a way to stick our finger at the U.S. and say, yeah, we can do something that you don't like us to do, even though we know we're not really going to do it. You can also placate a lot of people who want to see a relaxation of the law and may see this as that. I mean, let's face it, if you're the guy in that 15 gram or under category, you're going to like this law. This law is great for you, but it's not good for everyone else, and it's not good in terms of equality before and under the law. If you're selling drugs to me or I'm selling drugs to you, and just because one of us has 15 grams or under or not, it makes no difference. It's the same action. It's part of the same moral act, the same social act, the same economic act. To treat one of us different than the other in the transaction is not treating us equally before and under the law. And that's, to me, a very important principle that we have to stick to.
Well, if we look, though, the same thing applies to the prohibition on tobacco and the prohibition on alcohol. We've already accepted those in our society as a society. I mean, we're not, people are not protesting. They're not marching in the streets saying,
well, people are allowed to smoke alcohol and drink tobacco, but again,
the other way around.
Sorry,
unless you smoke the marijuana first, and then you've got a problem.
Then you can do it, yeah. But in any case, that's a private property issue, because that's less an issue of the substance itself. And quite frankly, I would agree with the government's right to prohibit smoking even, and I mean of cigarettes, marijuana, no drinking in public, on public property. That's their proper jurisdiction. That's where they can do things about things. But they have no right to go into people's homes or into their places of business and tell them how to run it. Smoking bylaws are the same thing. It's a different situation. As far as I'm concerned, if you're working in a democratic country where you want to keep everyone equal under the law, it's up to the owner of the establishment to determine the conditions of what goes on in his establishment. If he wants to allow smoking, that's the rules.
Well, what about the argument, the health argument relative to marijuana, where they say, it is... There's a potential that it's a carcinogen. There's a potential that it has
that's true.
Has possibly leads to genetic birth defects. There's a number of these.
Not much evidence of that.
No, but there's some potential, and the question, and I got an email today from somebody, said, why would we take a chance at all? If there's even a potential, why add this danger to our lives?
Well, no one's asking anyone to add that danger to their life. We're just asking you, don't put someone in jail who has chosen to take that risk. What's the sense in that? That's all we're asking. That's really what we have to do. We have to stop treating people just because they possess a substance, use a drug. People use all kinds of drugs. And the fact that some are legal and some are illegal is a nuance to me. It's not even an issue.
Well, let me ask you about the issue of control relative to quality. That's one of the arguments that was put forward about alcohol, to sort of standardize and control alcohol, was to ensure that the product was, quote, safe. One of the arguments about marijuana lately has been that the marijuana that's being grown these days has a potency that far exceeds what there used to be, and that there are all these various grades, but none of it's identified, so you don't know what you're getting, and that we'd be better off if the government did standardize and sell it in the liquor stores.
Well, it doesn't have to be the government. A private industry can standardize it, and they're doing it already. I mean, where people are selling seeds and stuff, they've got them all categorized. It's like a catalog. You can go and look it up. You don't have to go to the government to get this information. But the issue of actually trying to control it, that's really what it's all about. The government wants a monopoly here. Do you recall a while back the radio was running an ad that was sponsored by the government, telling Canadians that when they travel abroad to make sure they leave their drugs at home, because there's some pretty insane laws in other countries. What kind of message is the government giving there? It's like on the one hand, if we're supposed to be against drugs, why would we care? On the other hand, they're saying, listen, we know a lot of you are using drugs, which to me is a tremendous admission that they even have to put out an ad like that, and telling people, leave your drugs at home, don't trust strangers, and what a strange ad to be putting out there in an era of prohibition. It's quite a mixed message we're getting from the government. So, the idea that government's there doing it for health reasons is just a crock. I mean, I just don't buy it for a minute.
So I want to come back to something you said a few minutes ago, and that was that you don't think this is going to pass, in spite of the fact that the Prime Minister has said it's okay, the Justice Minister is apparently behind it, some of the backbenchers aren't, the Health Minister is not real thrilled about it, but it looks as though it's got the weight of cabinet behind it, and you still don't think it's going to pass.
Well, from what I've heard, there's going to be a lot of opposition to it in the House, so I don't know whether, I've never seen it pass yet. I'd be shocked if it does.
Well, who are they if we come back to something else you said, and you suggested there's a lot of people using this drug out there, who are the opponents in Parliament? Who are they speaking for then? Are they speaking still for a majority of their constituents, or do they have some...
The opponents to decriminalization?
To decriminalization. The people who say, Mr. Chrétien and Mr. Cauchon, you're wrong.
Well, I'm opposed to decriminalization per se. I'd rather see it be legalized, not have prohibition at all, or leave it as it is. What's more important is who supports prohibition. That's what I think is the story. The story, to me, if as I was saying on the radio show today, that if I was in the drug business, I'd be supporting drug laws. Because the best thing for a drug dealer, especially on a high level, is that keeping it on an underground market, he avoids taxation, he avoids all sorts of issues. It's a high markup product in terms of the profits that you can make. And with the government paying police to go around and bust little guys and little pushers, the big guys are actually having us pay to protect their monopoly. And that's what it all comes down to, again, is a monopoly. That's what the movie The Godfather was about, by the way, although it wasn't about marijuana, it was about stronger drugs. And The Godfather, as played by Marlon Brando, was actually the good guy in that movie. He did not want to deal in hard drugs, but the police and the rest of them did, because that's how the structure works, and that it feeds itself. If you didn't have prohibition, you wouldn't have the drug problem as we understand it today. There would still be drug issues with individuals. Don't get me wrong, that's an entirely separate issue.
Why do you think then we are where we are in the year 2003 on this issue, where we've got a government that's proposed, as you suggest, some fairly cursory changes to the legislation? We have what appears to be a fairly large number of users out there, if you believe the numbers that we see, and the government numbers in some cases, estimates of the size of the industry. Why then are we still where we are? Why is prohibition still a valid option here?
Because it represents a great deal of money and power for people in power. I mean, even in healthcare, look at what you've got now. If these laws go through, even there's a lot to be benefited by. Maybe that's why these ones will go through. You're going to have the government be able to do all its government propaganda, putting out all these ads that they're going to tell us, ads and education. That's how they want to, prevent us from using drugs after they quote decriminalize them. A strange duplicate message again. They want to control lifestyle. They have smoking bylaws, and it all comes down to what I call healthcare fascism. That's not, healthcare started off with socialism, and now we're getting down to controlling people in their private lifestyles and their private establishments. And we can't go there. The danger to us as citizens of a free society is far greater by having laws like this than any danger the drug can possibly present.
Well, why do you think we don't recognize that? I was reading the book the other day about Tommy Douglas in the beginning of socialized medicine, and his concern was he wanted to make sure everybody had medical care, because in those days not everybody did. You couldn't always get medical care. He wanted to fix that. That's the beginnings of our social medical system, and now it's to the point where it's almost reversed itself. Everybody can get care, but you can't go outside the system at all to do anything. And yet most Canadians sort of scratch their heads and go, well, isn't that one of the positive things about our country? Well, and it seems to me we're talking about the same thing here. We're kind of standing back and going, well, okay, yeah, there's a prohibition here, but isn't it ultimately for our own good?
And I think a lot of people buy that and believe it and think that it is doing us good, but the evidence speaks tomes to the contrary. Do you see many kids buying alcohol in the schoolyards? Or do you see a lot of kids buying pot in the schoolyards? Which of those two is more readily available? Well, of course, the second one, because it's illegal. And if there is an association between marijuana and the harder drugs, it's because we've lumped them all together in that same illegal basket. It wasn't until the 1970s that the government finally agreed that marijuana wasn't a narcotic, even though it's continually treated as a narcotic. And when you've got the government messing even with the English language, where they're applying the word narcotic to a substance that is not in any way, shape, or form, and putting people in jail based on that definition, how evil can you get?
Robert, thank you for joining us tonight. Always a pleasure
Thanks, Jim.
to take a look at the issues of the
Okay.
day with you. Bob Metz with us tonight talking about the issue of marijuana, and it is our You Say survey question tonight. We're asking you, do you support the government's decriminalization of marijuana, the proposals that they've made? Do you support what Mr. Cauchon is pushing for and what Mr. Chrétien says is okay too? 672-1313, that's our telephone number. Please do give us a call and register your vote on our You Say survey tonight. In just a moment, Glenn Herring will join us, campaign manager for Alliance leader Stephen Harper. We're going to take a look at the strategies of the Alliance as they attempt to broaden their base across Canada, what we can look for from a united right, or is such a thing possible, and whatever else we can manage to touch on as Jim Chapman Live continues tonight on Rogers Television. Now, interesting results on our You Say survey tonight. The question was, do you support the decriminalization of marijuana? And we talked about it with Bob Metz, about some of the pros and cons and the elements involved in this, some of the philosophical things behind it, at least as Bob sees the issue. We talked a little bit about the American opposition to it. We talked about the arguments about it as a gateway drug and a variety of other things. And when all is said and done, the voters split pretty much down the middle. 53% said yes, they do support it. 47% said no. Well, in most surveys, that's almost within the margin of error. You'd pretty much say it was a 50-50 split, which is interesting to me. It would be even more interesting if we could go further into it and talk to each one of our voters and ask them, on what grounds do you support it or oppose it? Because I wonder how those numbers would change, how many people might agree with Bob's philosophy on it, or other people who are opposed to it for philosophical reasons rather than practical. But the reality is it settled out at just about 50-50. 53% said yes, they do support the decriminalization. 47% said no, they don't. So interesting results tonight on our You Say survey.